Welcome, folksy folks. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. This show is about exploring the art, the creative expression, the story of humanity. It is the folk tales, fairy tales, folk music, the jokes, spiritual practices, and holidays we share in communities. I saw a reel a couple days ago that said Mother's Day in the US has the fewest crimes of all other days. And it continued, I can't help thinking about those mothers who can't commit crimes because they're out to brunch with their kids. And I loved I loved this example of digital folklore because it plays on something I think a lot of us are really familiar with, trying to get a reservation at a restaurant for Mother's Day, because that's such an incredibly difficult task on the busiest day of the year for restaurants. A few other fun facts about Mother's Day. It was celebrated as far back as ancient Greece. Mother's Day is the third most popular holiday in the world, behind Christmas and Easter. In the United States, it's the third highest selling holiday for flowers and plants. And like I said before, the busiest day for restaurants. Also, more phone calls are made on Mother's Day than any other day of the year, approximately 122 million phone calls being made. And it's super fun to know these fun facts that you can use at your next dinner party gathering. But this podcast is about more than just knowing cool trivia. It is about finding connection within your own community, connection across the pond with other communities, and with those who came before us. Because if it wasn't for Anne Jarvis, who is considered the founder of Mother's Day, and her daughter, Anna, who continued her legacy, President Woodrow Wilson might never have had the opportunity to sign Mother's Day into law in 1914. So if this sounds like a podcast that you want to continue to listen to, make sure you hit that subscribe button, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform like Apple or Spotify. And make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you get notifications every week when our podcast drops. And if you are a subscriber, thank you so much. We appreciate you. We would ask you to consider leaving us a review, because reviews are so helpful for indie podcasts like ourselves to be found by other listeners who might be interested in learning about exploring the origins and the history behind the folklore that we have grown to love. We have a wonderful show for you today. This episode is about celebrating mothers in honor of Mother's Day in the States and some other countries around the world. But not just any mothers, historical mothers, as told by storyteller Darci Tucker. And Darcy is a historian, author, playwright, actress, and storyteller. She portrays more than 20 women from American history and performs in venues nationwide. She's the author of a one woman play, Revolutionary Women, and the book of Embodying the Story Through Character Interpretation, a step by step guide to being someone you aren't. She is a veteran museum educator, was founding director of a character interpretation program at Tennessee University, and consults for museums and municipalities who want to improve their visitor experiences. So thank you so much, Darcy, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Vanessa. I'm excited to be here.
So give us a little bit of your background. How did you start combining the history and storytelling? Where did that path begin for you?
Well, I have an incredibly active imagination. I moved from California to Williamsburg, Virginia, straight out of college and got a job at Colonial Williamsburg, which is the nation's largest outdoor living history museum. And I
Mm,
was taking students on tours all through town, but I kept wondering, like, what would a conversation between this person in the town and that person in the town be like? And I constantly had these hypothetical conversations in my head. And I had worked there full time for almost 14 years when I quit the day job, and I had moved into a job I wasn't happy in. And my husband said, look, you love kids, you love traveling, find a way to travel and work with kids. And that's when the idea that, every elementary school kid in the country has to learn about the American Revolution, so I can put those
mm,
voices in my head to work
mhm,
teaching
mhm.
about the revolution. So that's kind of how it started.
And so tell us a little bit more about the Colonial Williamsburg Museum, because I believe I've been there. That's the one where George Washington's house is. Is that right?
That's Mount Vernon.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
it,
That's the
it
one I've been to. Okay.
Yeah, that's about 2.5 hours away. Mount Vernon is right outside Washington, D.C. We're 2.5 hours south,
Okay.
down kind of between Richmond and Norfolk. And Williamsburg was the capital of the colony of Virginia when it was a British colony. So George Washington was there all the time. That's
Mm.
where the government met. So Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Washington, they were all members of government and they were in that town all the time. And there are 89 structures still standing from before the American Revolution. Um,
Wow.
Whole or in part. I mean, some of them have had major redos, but
Yeah.
89 structures from that time, and then a couple hundred more reconstructions in between. So, if all goes right, when you go there, you feel like you stepped back in time and
Mm.
you're actually in the town around the time of the American Revolution. There are people practicing the trades the way they were done then, and they're not just doing it, they're actually creating stuff.
Yeah.
And are known experts worldwide in their trades. There are people portraying the 18th century residents of the town, and you can go through, historic buildings, and it's an amazing place. It's an amazing place.
And do people have like a specific accent or do they have like a specific way of talking to like kind of bring it all together or yeah.
Well, see, here's the thing. Nobody knows what people sounded like
Yeah.
200 years ago. Are no recordings of human voices. And so the best you can do is figure out which words rhymed with which words through poetry. And sometimes it's obvious, but like there's one poem that's very strictly rhymed and all the way through, but it rhymes the words day and tea. So was it day and tay or D and T or something in between?
Mm,
And they had different accents and dialects depending on where they were too. So the reality is no matter what accent someone put on it would be wrong.
right.
So, so
Because
there
there's
are
no
some
voice recordings.
exactly. So there are some interpreters that kind of go for a Britishy sounding accent, but a
Yeah.
lot of them don't bother because it would be wrong anyway.
Well, and I heard someone say, and I don't know if this is accurate, that the American accent is likely more closely related to what the British accent used to be. I
Yeah.
don't know if that
Yeah, absolutely. You know how now in at least upper crusty British, they
Mhm,
flatten out the R's. There's no real R sound.
mhm.
And but the words are spelled with R's, and there was no standardized spelling then. It was phonetically spelled. So if there was an R in someone's phonetical spelling, that means they
Mhm.
were hearing an R.
That's so
So
crazy.
yeah.
So were you always interested in history, like, even in school as a
Oh yeah.
schoolgirl?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I had it bad. I started reading Laura Ingalls Wilder's books when I was probably in second or third grade, and I wanted to be Laura. I mean, they were so real to me. I felt like I was right there with her. So that's kind of where it started. And then we took a trip and went to the Henry Ford Museum in Illinois, and I got
Mhm.
hooked on antique cars. And by the time I'm in fifth grade, here's my room. I had a handmade quilt on my bed. I had an antique trunk and an antique chair, and I had framed copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, and the Star Spangled Banner on my wall. So, yeah.
I hope you had some history nerd friends that appreciated your unique your unique style.
No, right? I mean, that's one of the things that's so wonderful about living in Williamsburg is I'm surrounded by history nerds now.
Yeah.
That's great.
All the people appreciate you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you started developing the characters in your head while you were at Williamsburg. Do you remember the first character that you started creating?
Well, I was cast in a play that was it's the reenactment of an actual witch trial that happened in either 1704, 1706. A
Hmm.
woman named Grace Sherwood was the last woman in Virginia accused of witchcraft.
Mm.
And so there was a play that was partly scripted from the 18th century documentation, but it was partly improv. And the audience would get to ask questions. And so that's my first
Oh.
foray into doing character interpretation. And then I was incredibly lucky to get chosen to be the governor's wife, Lady Dunmore, and a Scottish countess.
In the
And so
play?
No, that was just sheer improv. That was, meeting with the public and
Oh,
just interacting, just make it up as you go. Although that's it's not make it up as you go because there's a
right.
whole lot of study that goes in behind it, but it was
Hmm.
pure improv. So I had that experience before I wrote the play. Um, the first the first characters I did that were not, at Colonial Williamsburg were the ones in the play Revolutionary Women. And I picked Deborah Sampson. I needed to have a loyalist, a patriot, and someone undecided. And
Mm-hmm.
most women did housewifery all their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not real exciting
Mm-mm.
for modern audience anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
so I thought, well, Deborah Sampson was a soldier, and how many women were soldiers, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
has real appeal. And then Elizabeth Thompson in Charleston was a loyalist spy. So those two appealed to me for the action involved. And then the third character I invented from a whole cloth because there were things I needed to teach that I couldn't teach with the two real characters. So
Mm-hmm.
the follower is fictitious. I created those three kind of all at the same time. It was I
Mm-hmm.
was working on a whole product. So, but here's the thing, this is before there was Bluetooth, right? So I'd be driving along in my car interviewing Deborah Sampson or interviewing Elizabeth Thompson,
Uh-huh.
talking to myself, asking questions, answering questions. There's no one else in the car. And it was before Bluetooth. So I'm sure people were like, what?
You kind of look like you were singing along to your music in a passionate way.
Exactly. Maybe someone, slumped down in the back seat. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure it was perfectly normal. Okay, you were chosen to be the governor's wife by whom?
Well, there was already someone who was cast as the governor at
Okay,
Colonial Williamsburg, and he
okay.
happened to be the director of Cry Witch, the witch trial that I was in. And
Oh,
he wrote a lot of theatrical stuff. His name is Carson Hudson. He's brilliant.
okay.
And they said, okay, we want a Lady Dunmore. Who do you think would be good for the role? And he had
Mhm.
seen me, acting and improving in Cry Witch, so he picked me. And Vanessa, it was a Cinderella thing. I mean, I'm one of the many, many, many women who grew up with really low self-esteem,
Mm,
really feeling unattractive, undesirable, not that smart, all that stuff.
mhm,
And to get chosen for that role was truly life-changing for me.
mm,
I would be just plain old me. And then I would get into a costume with, a wig up to here and hoops out to there and be the most important woman in the colony and walk into the room and people had to bow to me. And and I had to
what a
think on my
feeling.
right. And I had to think on my feet because I was doing the loyalist perspective and everyone is programmed to
Mm,
think, yay, independence. And I
mhm,
had to lay out, convincingly all of the reasons that independence is a really bad idea. And it pushed me professionally and it pushed me emotionally. And I actually had a teacher freak out on me one time. We have a teacher institute, a week-long program,
mhm.
and this guy got so he believed it. He was so engaged and so irate that he actually he didn't physically touch me, but he pursued me and would have backed me into a corner and was screaming at me, and his spit was hitting my face. And I had to hold my ground
Yeah.
and say to him, "Sir, you are a guest in my house, and if you cannot behave accordingly, I must ask you to leave." And I found courage and strength I
Mhm,
didn't know was in there.
mhm,
Um, I don't know if you've heard of Sheila Arnold. She's a nationally known storyteller and one of my best friends. And she was working with me at Colonial Williamsburg at the time.
mhm.
And afterwards, I was totally shaken by this experience. And she said to me, "You are that strong. If you didn't have the strength to stand up to him, you wouldn't have been able to. So
Mhm.
next time someone gets in your face, you just reach down and pull up Lady Dunmore
Mm.
and It'll be fun. You know,
Yeah.
it literally, it's a role that literally changed my life. It was just like being Cinderella. And then, the ball is over and I go back and put on my sweats.
Yeah. But you
Yeah.
talked so we met before because we met at the Texas Folklore, annual conference,
Yes.
um, and you were talking about how putting on a costume can really change your mindset and help put you in that space. And you were just describing that a bit, how like being in that costume really helps to solidify that character. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think we've all experienced you put on a beautiful dress to go out to dinner, you just feel different.
Hmm.
Um, you feel different if you're wearing gardening clothes than if you're
Hmm.
wearing professional clothes. The clothes we put on affect the way we feel.
Hmm.
And especially if you're putting on historic clothing, because of the way it forms your body, if you're wearing corsets or stays, which I wear when it's appropriate,
Hmm.
it makes you move differently than you do in your normal life. And those physical restrictions and just the knowing that what you're wearing is different changes your mindset.
Hmm.
And the really interesting thing I have found is I love costuming. That's one of the really fun parts. And I don't have the money to have 100% accurate costuming,
Hmm.
but I'm really good at finding pieces at thrift shops, at in my own closet, wherever that I can combine and I can tweak and rig and alter in one way or another and create costuming that is close enough to accurate for my purposes.
Hmm.
And I found any number of times I know how to sew, and especially when I'm hand sewing, that's when I find the character's voice. I research, 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 study, study, study for months, sometimes years to put a character together. And all of those facts are kind of cut and dried facts in my head
Hmm.
somehow until I sit down with a needle and thread. And when I'm making or altering the clothing that that person is going to wear, all of a sudden she's real to me.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think it's a strange thing, but I think I feel this connection to womankind throughout history when I'm sewing, when I'm hand sewing, because I know that my mother, my grandmother, my great grandmother, my great great, back to the beginning, that's how they
Hmm.
spent so much of their time,
Yeah.
that it takes me back into the place where I find that character's voice.
Yeah. I think about today how sometimes people take up sewing as a hobby, as something fun to do, whereas
Yeah.
in the in our past, it was not a fun hobby. It was something that you had to absolutely do in order to clothe yourself.
Right. Right. And I've often thought about too, like, oh, those poor women who were crummy seamstresses,
Yeah.
because everyone would know, because your clothes would look crummy. You
Hmm.
It's like you walked around as a billboard for your own stitching ability.
Yeah. I thought about that recently because I have a collaborative episode once a month called Fairy Tale Flip with Donna Lee Fields, and we did Rumpelstiltskin. And it's about a woman who doesn't know how to spin straw into gold, but in other tales, it's just about spinning. She doesn't spin. She doesn't know how to spin. And that was so crucial for women. And I just think like, I'm a terrible housekeeper. Like that is not a skill set that I that I hone or I'm good at.
You and I
And
both.
like, you know, we all have our different talents, but they had to do it regardless if they were good at it or not. And so, yeah, I
Right.
just feel for those women who
And they weren't judged on it.
yes.
Things.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I would have been judged pretty heavily in those societies.
Right.
All right, so you do these performances for schools and festivals. Tell us a little bit about where all you're doing these one woman plays, these performances.
So pre-COVID, of course, I was traveling all over the country my main audiences were in California and Oklahoma, and I would spend, ooh, I don't know, 7, 8 weeks on the road in California and Oklahoma every year.
Wow.
Um, and then of course I had to do the quick shift and create a studio in my office and
Uh-huh.
do everything online and figure out how to get all the different characters settings in this one space. Um, this is the first year I went back out on the road again. I spent 2 weeks performing in California and a week in Oklahoma, and it just felt so good. In fact, it was funny because I went to the doctor right after I got back from California, and I said, I just had my first program in front of 150 live fifth graders for the first time since COVID, and I forgot how much fun it is.
Mm.
And the doctor said, "Oh, that sentence did not end at all the way I thought it was going to." But it's just a completely different thing when
Mhm.
their little faces are right there in front of you, and
Mhm.
they're engaged and you can see it. It's a completely different animal.
Mhm.
Um, so schools are my main thing. And then increasingly I'm getting picked up by museums. And this summer I'll be doing um, in the next couple of weeks, I'm doing a suffrage character. I have Harriet Stanton Blatch was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter,
Mhm.
and her mom starts the suffrage movement before she's born, and she's a grandmother by the time women finally get the vote. So she's
Mm.
able to talk about the whole scope of the suffrage movement. But I'm doing her for a local university this summer, and I'm doing Revolutionary Women, my play about the American Revolution, at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, a local museum. Um, so I do a lot of museums and uh, you know school groups that are coming into Williamsburg. Sometimes they'll book me to do an evening program for them.
Mm,
So
cool.
yeah, yeah. It's mostly my main audience is fifth graders, which are the
Mm.
perfect age because they're still really excited. They're really interested. They're not embarrassed to show it.
Mhm.
And they are ready to grasp some really tough issues, justice and right and wrong and that kind of stuff. So they're just fun.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
do for every age. I do for all ages.
But you're making that one woman play into a book, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I've been meaning to do it. I wrote it 24 years ago, and I've been thinking all along I should make it into a book. I should make
Yeah.
it into a book. But I'm a one woman, I do everything, booking, billing, advertising, website, everything.
Yeah.
And so the book just kept getting pushed back. But I got a fellowship from Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, paid time to go and use their resources and have an office and have an apartment for a month. And that was
Nice.
2 years ago. But that kind of kick-started me. So now I'm working on it more earnestly than I'm actually slowly.
Well, I look forward to reading that. That's
Hey,
really awesome.
yeah, yeah. It's what I realized though? It's not one book, it's really three, because
Mhm.
it's all three characters and they never encountered each other. So I've got to find a way to weave these three different stories together when
Mm.
they didn't actually weave. It's like three,
Yeah.
it's a lot more than I thought it was.
And they they were never in the same place at the same time?
No, nope. And if they were, it would have been a really dicey conversation.
Yeah. Maybe you can have a chapter that's this is fantastical where they are talking together, but they never actually met.
Exactly.
Just use your imagination.
Right, exactly.
So all of your characters women?
They are, for two reasons. One is that the men have had plenty of airtime. Everyone knows all about the men. Um, so I feel like it's time to give the women some airtime because we were doing important things too.
Yep.
Um, the other is that I walk into a room and I need my audience to believe me now. So Deborah Sampson, I portray dressed as a man, But
Mhm.
the very first thing I do is introduce myself. Hello, I'm Robert Shirtliff, or as I'm better known, Deborah Sampson, the female soldier.
Mhm.
Because the more time my audience spends going, is that a guy or a girl? I
Mhm.
don't the more time they're thinking about that, the less time they're thinking about the story I need to tell.
Mhm.
So I just get it out of the way right up front. I'm actually a woman, and that way they can relax and concentrate on the story, not on trying to figure me out.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. And so women aren't given a voice and we don't hear their stories, but why do you think it's important that we learn from them?
well, not only are women half the population, all of those, the men that you hear so much about, um, sometimes there were women very actively involved in
Mhm.
I think, John and Abigail Adams are a really good example.
Right.
She was his sounding board. She was constantly giving him advice, correcting him,
Yeah.
telling him what she thought was wrong and all that. She helped frame his thinking process. And although that relationship was more publicly that way,
Mhm.
that there were a heck of a lot of other relationships that were the same way and
Yeah.
continue to be. The men who continue to dominate public office have intelligent wives to go home to who say, "What the heck are you thinking?"
Mhm.
So women have behind the scenes forever been shaping public policy and been
Mhm.
shaping the opinions of their husbands and their sons and their grandsons. Um, there also have been plenty of women who have done it more publicly and just not been publicized.
Mhm.
Amelia Earhart is one of the characters I portray. And one of the things I love is that when she was growing up in the teens and early 20s, 19 teens and 1920s, she was keeping a scrapbook of women that she heard about that were doing amazing things, women who were doctors, women who were attorneys, women who were mayors of cities and that kind of thing. There have been women doing the same kind of public facing important things men have done all
Mhm.
along. Um, well, not completely all along, but for the last couple hundred years anyway, in small numbers, but we don't
Mhm.
hear about them. So
Right.
why not? Sometimes they were the inventors, that or the artists that their husbands or their coworkers have taken credit for.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
um,
I remember listening to something about Ben Franklin's sister was incredibly intelligent. And he I don't know, like he didn't treat her well. Like she was impoverished. And she spent a lot of time doing laundry, but she was like this really smart individual and gave him a lot of ideas, but you never hear about I mean, you don't even know that he had a sister, right?
Right. Exactly. And how many women, like one of the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton talked about was how constantly she was reminded that it was a shame she was a girl. That, her dad talked to her all the time about how she was the smartest of the kids. She could have gone really, really far if only she'd been a boy.
Right.
Um, squash, squash, squash. And
Mhm.
um, there's an 18th century woman whose name escapes me at the moment, but she had the same experience. She wrote in her diary about the fact that um, her father would kind of bring her out and make her perform for everyone, long soliloquies and all that kind of stuff, and constantly tell her it's darn shame you're a girl.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, think about how frustrating those women's lives have been to
Yeah,
have constantly told, nope, 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 nope. Yes, you're more
yeah,
qualified, but no.
yeah. You're so intelligent, but you just have to sew and do housework instead.
Yeah, and look pretty.
Do you feel like women historically in historical documents, do you feel like they see or hear things that are different than men do?
Yeah, because a woman's main role through most of history was to keep the children alive.
Mhm.
This is a world that was with, and until the 1940s was without antibiotics.
Mhm.
Um, and until the late 18th century was without vaccinations. It was a world in which natural selection was really active. And
Mhm.
in the 18th century, the infant mortality rates were just horrific. 1 out of 5 babies died in their first year, and
Mhm.
half of all kids on average died before they were 20. So a woman's job was to keep the kids alive, which
Mhm.
really there's nothing more important than that, is there?
Mhm.
And those women were raised knowing chemistry. They didn't call it that, but they were raised to know what plants in their gardens could make the medicines that would help those kids. They were
Mhm.
raised to know how to set broken bones. They were raised to know how to what the chemistry is of cooking, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I'm a cook, but there's a lot of chemistry involved in that. There and it was a full-time job. I mean, I think really honestly, electricity. If you have to pick one thing that changed women's lives, it's electricity. Because just doing the laundry before electricity,
Mhm.
one load took hours and hours
Yeah.
and hours of time. So, I often think, the average 18th century housewife could probably easily arm wrestle and beat the average 21st century man because they were doing hard physical labor all the time
Uh-huh.
to keep the family clothed and fed. And um, yeah, they had a really hard job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really hard job.
And the heartache of losing
Oh,
a half
gosh.
of your children must have
Yes.
just been so
Oh,
drastically difficult.
oh yeah. And that if you read the diaries of men and women side by side, the men's diaries are about business and travel and those kinds of things. The women's diaries are largely about the health of their family. They're practically obsessed with the health of their families and the health of their friends because they are so, so painfully aware
Mhm.
that, your kid sneezes tonight, your kid could be dead by the end of the week. They
Mhm.
knew that. And it haunted them. And I've heard people say, oh, well, they didn't get emotionally attached to their kids. And I say, No way. First of all, women's diaries show that they were.
Mhm.
Men men were more detached from their children than they tend to be today, but
Mhm.
even so, men's diaries do show grief when they lose a child. And I always think, what the heck? You adopt a puppy, and if that puppy died the next day, you'd be brokenhearted. And that's a puppy, right?
Yeah.
It's your child you've been carrying for 9 months and caring for. There's no way that people weren't emotionally attached to their kids. And I,
Mhm.
I think part of what makes people think that is naming patterns. 18th century naming patterns, you tended to use family names over and over again.
Mhm.
And and I know of one family that had three daughters named Mary because the first two Marys died.
Mm.
Mary
Mhm.
died, and there was another girl, and she was named Mary, and she died, and the third she was named Mary.
Mhm.
There were other kids in between, but that wasn't because they didn't care about the first two Marys.
Mhm.
It was just a naming pattern
Mhm.
custom in their society to try to keep the name alive.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
you see breaks when a woman loses a child. If she's a consistent diary keeper, you see sometimes a month, 2 months, 3 months where she doesn't write a word before she
Mhm.
starts writing again because she just can't.
What do you say?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, do you feel I mean, obviously there has been major shifts in society's perspective on mothers and motherhood and their role. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think I
I know
get
that's a
questions
huge
from
question.
right, right. I get questions from kids all the time, like, why did women have to stay at home? And I always say, I don't know. I think it goes back to cave people, probably, right? Back when it was biologically necessary for the woman to be there, that gave the man the freedom to.
Mhm.
And I think we're creatures of habit, and those habits go on for centuries. But like I say, I think honestly, the biggest difference is electricity, which has opened doors for women. Now, it's made women feel like they have to do everything.
Mhm.
I'm not certain it's made life easier in all ways,
Mhm.
because now it's women are expected to do everything. And I don't have kids.
Mhm.
And I've marveled at my colleagues who manage to show up every day for work when they've got kids at home and stuff going on at home. And where do women get the energy
Yeah.
to do all that? Um, the thing that makes it possible is electricity, which means that we can get food from, halfway across the planet and stick it in our freezer and it's ready for us when we need it 6 months from now,
Mhm.
instead of having to prepare everything right then. Um, we're not dipping candles. We're not. So electricity opened doors, but also set new expectations.
Mhm.
I remember my mom, who is my best friend in the world, and I remember when I was struggling with what do I want to do with my life, and she said, I on the one hand, I envy you because you have so many choices. In my day, it was secretary or teacher or nurse.
Mhm.
But she said, on the other hand, it's really hard, isn't it? Having so many options is a
Yeah.
problem in itself. Back then it was pick one and do it.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
And motherhood now, I think, I love the fact that motherhood has in a way expanded to include fathers.
Mhm.
Like my Deborah Sampson character, it's amazing. She left her 4 kids at home and went on the road as a public speaker, and it was for less than a year. But her husband stayed home with the kids. What? In the 1700s? What? But I love the fact that now being a mother can mean being the primary breadwinner
Mhm.
while dad stays home with the
Yeah.
kids. Love the fact that there are options now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, let's go into your characters. Deborah Sampson. Tell us about her.
Okay. So Deborah Sampson was born probably about 1760. She was born near Boston. So eventually, when the closing of the port of Boston after the Tea Party and all that kind of stuff, all those Boston kind of political events affected the communities that she lived in and formed her political opinion. She was one of 6 kids. Her parents had a terrible marriage, screaming at each other all the time.
Mhm.
When her dad left, the story is that her mom threw a skillet at him, which narrowly missed his head. So it was not a great marriage.
Mhm.
And the 18th century way of and her mother was too ill really to take care of the kids. And so the 18th century method of taking care of kids who weren't being adequately cared for was that in Virginia, the church would remove them. I don't know in other colonies if it was the church, but they would remove the kids from a single mother who couldn't handle it
Mhm.
and um, apprentice them out. The word apprenticeship, it, it's a there's a the word indenture is what I'm looking for. Indenturement
Mhm.
contract. So the kids would be indentured, and the
Basically
boys usually,
slaves.
well, no, not so much. More like the boys are going to be put in trades.
Okay.
Okay, they're raised, they have to be fed and clothed and housed, and they have to be taught the trade. They have to be taught both the arts and mysteries. They have to be taught um, reading, writing, mathematics, so that they are prepared to work. When
Mhm.
they finish their apprenticeship, they're prepared to go get a job
Okay.
somewhere. Okay. So, not that they were treated well, that depended on who their master was, and some of them were abused, but an apprentice had a contract, so an apprentice actually could take their master to court. If they weren't
Oh,
being taught, if they were being abused, they could take them to court.
okay. That's
Um,
good.
Girls were generally apprenticed to housewifery, how to be a housewife.
Mhm.
So they were taught a whole lot less bookkeeping and accounting and that kind of thing, but a whole lot more of the chemistry of
Mhm.
making medicines and cooking and that kind of stuff. Because the expectation for most girls was you're going to get married and become a housewife.
Mhm.
Sometimes girls were apprenticed to trades too, in which case they would learn the arts and mysteries of the trade, and they'd get the bookkeeping, accounting, all that, because they might start their own shop.
Mhm.
So it was the 18th century version of foster care. And just like kids in foster care today are housed and go to school to prepare them for life, these kids were housed and taught life skills to
Mhm.
prepare them for life. So that's what happened to Deborah and her five siblings. And she ended up, she bounced between several different, they put her with for an old lady who died, and then they put her with another old lady who died. And basically she was there to be nursemaid to these women. And
Mhm.
finally she landed in a farm family with five sons, and she was a real tomboy, and she played with the boys and got really good at riding a horse and shooting a gun and climbing trees and all that stuff. Um and that appealed to her. She was such a tomboy that really appealed to her much more than the sit down and sew or go dip the candle.
Mhm.
So when the war started, she found herself, like all women, being told stay home and sew shirts.
Mhm.
And eventually she decided, look, I'm tall. I'm really good at shooting and writing and all those things. I'm not great looking. She was a very rugged featured young woman. She had a
Mhm.
really heavy brow, really square jaw. She had one of those faces that, depending on the clothes around it, could go either way.
Mm.
So she just had the idea, well, I'll just pass myself off as a guy so that I can enlist, because
Uh-huh.
what I really want to do is join the fight. And she managed to do that for a year and a half. She disguised her identity. She signed up late enough in the war that the men who were old enough to actually serve, you had to be at least 16. Um, the recruiters were having a hard time getting enough recruits by this time. It was in 1781. It was after the Battle of Yorktown. It was right at the end of the war. And so there were a lot of boys of 12 and 13 who were lying. Oh, yes, sir, I'm 16. And the recruiting officers were like, okay, if you're dumb enough to want to go get shot at here,
Yeah.
sign here. So that's what they thought they had with her. They saw this tall boy who wasn't shaving, didn't have broad shoulders, still had a high voice. Well, he's 12, he's 13, he's
Mhm.
lying about his age.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the ways that she managed to hide her identity, was simply because they thought she was younger
Yeah.
than she said. And because in their world, most of them had never in their lives seen a woman wearing anything other than a skirt.
Mhm.
Put a human body in male clothes.
The
It
male.
was actually against the law for a woman to wear men's clothes in yeah, because there was no separation of church and state. And there's somewhere back in the Old Testament that says it's an abomination for a woman to wear men's clothes. So in most of the colonies, it was against the law. So she walks up in men's clothes and they see a boy.
Mhm.
And that's how she hid her identity, because we see what we expect to see.
Was she found out?
The only reason she was found out, she actually got shot. And here's where she fits into the folklore thing, right?
Mhm.
She was a storyteller. She helped write a book later on, and uh, she never knew that she was going to be used as a vehicle for teaching about the American Revolution, right?
Mhm.
She and this guy were writing books because they had kids that were hungry and they needed to feed them. So they wrote a great adventure story, and they
Mhm.
based it on her life, but it was hugely fiction. Um, so I can't remember in the book where she said she was shot, but it's documented that she told some people she was shot in the leg, some people she was shot in the shoulder, some people she was shot in the chest. The military record is clear. She was shot and removed the bullet herself.
Mm.
So there's only one bullet, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the places where I, as the playwright, historian, had to figure out what makes the most sense. What is the most survivable and treatable of those three wounds? And the leg is the most survivable and treatable.
Yeah.
So so she took that bullet out herself so that the surgeon wouldn't find out she was a woman.
Mhm.
Then she ends up in Philadelphia and she gets the measles. And she's delirious with fever. They undress this poor, sweating, feverish soldier boy to put him to bed, and he's not a boy.
Yeah.
So that's how she was discovered. If she hadn't passed out from the fever, she probably never would have gotten caught at all. But because she was delirious, she got caught. And here's the remarkable thing. She was in at least two laws. It was against the law for a woman to wear men's clothes. It was
Hmm.
also against the law for a woman to enlist. So she really figured she would have been executed if she was caught. That's what she thought, because
Yeah.
military justice was really severe. Um, but the doctor only told her commanding officer, and he actually um, told her he wished he could keep her, that she was one of the best soldiers he had. He had to discharge her, but he gave her an honorable discharge, making her eligible for a pension. Then
Wow.
later, um, Paul Revere began writing letters to the United States Congress on her behalf, and that same General Patterson, um, was helping Paul Revere to get her the pension that was overdue. So, um, I mean, he didn't even give her a dishonorable discharge. He was
Yeah.
like, full on, congratulations, well done. I wish I could keep you. So
Yeah.
she also was one of the best. She was in the light infantry, which was kind of on the same level as SEAL Team 6 today. The most elite troops were the light infantry. And she was in the light infantry. So she was just an amazing soldier.
Hmm.
And I think he really was bummed that he had to discharge her.
Yeah. And I would imagine, but she got married and she had children?
Yes. So for the rest of her life, she lived by society's expectations, right?
Hmm.
She married, it was like a year and a half after, um, and they had three kids of their own, and then they adopted a child. She had a friend who had a baby and died either in childbirth or as a result of childbirth.
Hmm.
And so they adopted that baby, Susanna, and raised her as their own, which I think is really cool that she was raised in foster care, and then
Hmm.
she turned around in later life and took in a child who
Yeah.
needed a home.
That's a
Um,
beautiful full circle moment.
it is. It really is. Um, but when Earl was 19 and Susanna was 7 and Mary and Patience were 14 and 15, I think, she left the kids at home for a while with her husband, and like I said, went on the road and rented out theaters around New England and gave lectures about what it was like to be a female soldier. And she, put on men's clothes again. I don't know if it was the same uniform, if she could fit, but
Hmm.
put on men's clothes and marched around with her gun and did the manual of arms, which is all the different ways you have to hold the gun and all that, to prove that she knew the manual of arms. And um, she was called the celebrated Mrs. Gannett. Her married name was Gannett. And then something happened in New York, and theater audiences back then were pretty raucous, and they would scream and yell and they would throw stuff and all that. And she got booed off the stage in New York. And she was already homesick. Her diary during that travel, it's all about, I miss my kids. I miss my kids. I want to go home. I miss my kids. And so when she got booed off the stage, she was like, that's it. I'm done. I'm going home. And
Hmm.
she never spoke publicly again. But in Sharon, Massachusetts, which is where they ended up living, they called her the old soldier. And it was not meant as a compliment. It wasn't, oh yes, the old soldier. It was like, yeah, the old soldier lives here. So her own community, I mean, what she did was so outside the bounds of what women were supposed to do,
Yeah.
that the town was embarrassed that she was theirs.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I can't document this, but I've just got to think that they took that out on her kids, you
Mm.
know? I mean,
Hmm.
that's what people do. They say stuff behind each other's backs.
Hmm.
She walks by, a kid hears parents talking about, oh, there she goes, the old soldier.
Hmm.
That had to have an impact on her kids.
Hmm.
And I just think how heartbreaking that must have been for her, that a decision she made, um, and did not regret,
Right.
but that her kids were paying a price for it. It
Hmm.
had to have eaten at her,
We don't
you
have
know?
diaries from the kids.
No,
Mm.
Not that I have found anyway.
Hmm.
And not that I haven't seen anything that she's written that actually talks about the effect on her kids.
Hmm.
It's just one of those logical things to me, and that's where I've done the artistic leap to, if this, then probably that.
Yeah. Because
So,
society had a very strong pattern during
yeah,
that time,
exactly.
and it does today too.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I know in the history community, there are phrases that go around a lot. History is messy is one of them. Another that my friends have been saying a lot is people are people and they do people-y things.
People and things. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And they pretty
That's
much
true.
always have.
Yes. We continue to be people
Exactly.
who are messy.
Exactly. And doing people-y things.
Okay, so another character that you perform for the Texas Folklore Annual Conference, Society Annual Conference, was Jane Long. So tell us about her. And it was interesting when you told that story. I feel like that was a story that I should have known from, because I'm from Texas, and I should have known that from my Texas history days, but I had never
Right.
heard of her. So that was very brand new to me.
Yeah. And Jane Long is an example of that woman that I was talking about that was intelligent and was there in the room and had her opinions and influenced people, but it's Jim Bowie and Sam Houston
Hmm.
and the guys that were in the room that get all the credit.
Hmm.
um, her life, her later life is very well documented, but there is a period of Jane Long's life that really we only have her word for. And there was one of the early, I don't know if you heard about Mirabeau Lamar. I had never heard about him, but he was the second president of the Republic of Texas when it was an independent
Hmm.
republic. And he was one of them that was in the room the whole time with the Sam Houstons and those guys.
Hmm.
Um, he was fascinated by Jane Long's husband, James Long, who I'll tell you about in a minute. And he spent years documenting James Long's story. And so I'm pretty certain that's probably where the Jane Long information comes from. And he was getting the information from her for the most part.
Hmm.
Okay, so here's what happened. It is just after the War of 1812. There there is some debate over where the border is between Spain, who owns Mexico at the time, and the United States. And there's a group of guys in Texas who decide that, okay, if Spain and the United States can't work it out, we'll just take it.
Hmm.
So they lead what's called a filibuster. And that was a new thing to me because I knew about filibusters in Congress, but a
Hmm.
filibuster is a private, unsanctioned war. So they raise 300 or so men and they march into Texas and they put up their new flag that Jane Long designed, a red flag with a white star. And they say, this is now the Republic of Texas, and I, James Long, am now the president.
As you
And
do.
as one does. But the really remarkable thing is that they actually got recognized by several nations, the United States and um, Spain initially, and Britain and the Netherlands and someone else said, okay, welcome, new country. They had a printing press, they got all set up. And then Spain changed its mind and chased them back out. And then they went back the next year and tried it again. And eventually, James Long goes down to try to take over another town. He gets captured. By this time, Mexico owns Mexico and he gets killed. Well, the Jane Long part of the story is that when James led the filibuster down to Texas the first time, she desperately wanted to go along. She
Mhm,
had a baby and she was pregnant. And he said, no, you can't go.
mhm,
And so she waited long enough to have the baby. And then she left the baby and the toddler with her sister and went on down to Texas. And while they were in Texas that first go round before they got chased out, the baby died. So
Mm,
by the time they got back to Louisiana, where she had left the kids, only her older daughter, Anne, is still alive.
mhm,
And she decides from then on, it doesn't matter, how dangerous it is. I'm not going to be separated from my children. That's not going to happen again.
mhm,
So when they go into Texas the second time, she takes Anne with her. And by this time, Anne is 5, maybe.
mhm,
Um, when James leaves on the trip where he got captured, um, the troops that they had were in real disarray at that point. And when he didn't come back immediately, the troops began leaving until eventually the only people left were Jane and her daughter Anne and her slave Kian. And Jane, by this time, is extremely pregnant, and she has argued with her husband. She wants to go with him this time, and he has said, no, 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 you're pregnant. You can't go. So fine, I'll stay. So now there's just the three of them, and she's pregnant, and there's no one there. And it was one of the very coldest winters on record. Galveston Bay froze over.
mm,
She talked about seeing a bear walking across the ice from Galveston Island over to Bolivar Point, where they were. Um, there was an Indian tribe, the Karankawa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who were reputed at the time to be cannibals. And she saw a Karankawa canoe coming across Galveston Bay at one point when it wasn't frozen over. So she and Kian, her enslaved maidservant, they fire the cannon to scare the invaders away. They hike a petticoat up the flagpole so it looks like there's a flag. And from then on, they fire a cannon every day and keep the flag up. And then Kian marches around in bits and pieces of uniforms that the guys had left behind to make it look like there are troops still at the base to try to keep them away. She's getting more and more, Jane is getting more and more pregnant.
mhm,
Finally, she is ready to deliver while the bay is frozen over. And at this point, Anne and Kian both are on their deathbed, kind of sick. Like, she doesn't think they are going to survive. There is
mhm,
no one to help her give birth. So she gives birth to Mary by herself, does it herself. And then I assume, because what she said was, and then she had to go out just after giving birth and chop frozen fish out of the water to try to keep them all fed and alive. And I thought, what in the world is she going to do with that baby? And she's got two feverish people there. So in my mind, I have her putting the baby in between those two feverish bodies to try to keep that baby warm
mhm,
while she's going out to chop frozen fish out of the ice to feed them and nurse them back to health. And I
mhm,
just, they talk about mama bear. Mama bear will do anything to protect her children.
mhm,
And my goodness, if Jane Long is not mama bear at that moment, she's having that baby, and then despite her exhaustion and her pain and everything else, she is not going to let them die.
mhm.
And and I just think, wow,
Yeah.
wow, how fierce, how fierce.
I just can't even imagine.
I know, I know. Um, eventually Stephen Austin is bringing settlers through, and they finally manage to convince her to go on with the settlers and to leave the island. But and then she goes on, as I say, not only is just her fierceness show then, but she is so rugged that even though Mary does end up dying, she and Anne move back to Texas, and she not only becomes a rancher. She gets a land grant just like the men do out of respect for her husband. She goes into cattle ranching. Her brand is documented, and she opens a hotel. And that hotel is where all the planning happened for the Alamo and all the planning for the eventual Republic of Texas. And before the Alamo, she hid gunpowder in one of her outbuildings on the property that was used in the Battle of the Alamo.
Mm,
Um, So she was front and center from before any of the big male names ever
Mm-hmm.
get to Texas. Jane Long is already there in Texas and is there through up through Reconstruction, through the Civil War and up through Reconstruction. She's there the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. So she is part documented story. I mean, from the point that she joins Stephen Austin's settlers and goes with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then before, at the time that is truly folklore is that winter that they're alone at Bolivar Point
Mm-hmm.
because there's only her word.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but either she was incredibly fierce or she was one heck of a storyteller.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But some
Yeah.
call her the mother of Texas. Is that right?
Yes. And there are kind of two reasons for that. Number one is that Mary, who was born on Bolivar Point, was the first Anglo child born in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So she's the physical mother of Texas, the
Mm-hmm.
first American in Texas, basically. And then and also because of the fact that she was the woman who was behind the scenes, she was um the woman who helped give birth to the independent Republic of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
and she wasn't just the hotel keeper. Sam Houston courted her. Mirabeau Lamar courted her. She was gorgeous, and she was admired by all the leaders of the revolutionary movement down there, and any number of them, courted her and wanted to marry her, and she was a woman who had really serious influence. So
But
so
she
from
never
that,
married again.
she never married again. No, she only gave her hand and her heart to one man, and that was James Long.
What a
Yeah,
story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think too, just in a time when most widows would remarry,
Yeah.
especially a young widow with a child, would look for the security of a husband.
Hmm.
She she
She
said, "I
didn't
am strong to do this
she didn't
myself."
need the security. So why
Right.
remarry to someone who's gonna take over everything that you've already built for yourself?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't
So,
blame
and there
her.
are pictures of her. The one thing that I really question about her is her fashion sense, because um, the hairstyle in the 1830s is these ringlets right on the side of your face.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, that goes out pretty quickly, but to her dying day, she had the ringlets on the side of her face. She's this old, obviously toothless, wrinkly, wizened woman with these curls on the side of her face, still the young glamour queen.
So she just kept that one fashion statement for a long time.
Right? That's right.
She didn't move with the
When you have
times.
a look that works, just go with it.
All right, so you we talked a little bit about you writing your new book that will be published soon, hopefully. But you have one that's out, is that right? The Embodying the Story Through Character Interpretation?
Yes. Yeah, I wrote that 2011,
Mhm.
and it's a step-by-step guide to how to pick a character, and it's good for teachers. It's written for museums and museum educators. So for the museums it talks about how to decide if you're going to have people portraying historical figures,
Mhm.
uh, but how to decide on the character in the first place. And one of the things I think is important is don't always go for the famous person, because
Mhm.
there are compelling stories, and sometimes you can also get a lot more insight by using a friend or a family member or a bystander can tell you things about the famous person that
Mhm.
you know that they can't. So how to pick the character, how to do the research, how to do the scripting, basic story arc. What are the things you need? How to give it a cliffhanger of an ending, because you don't want to answer every question. You want to compel your audience to want to know more. Um, Costuming, some basic performance stuff. And it is available through my website, but thank you for pointing out that the link is broken. So I've got to fix that link this weekend. But the book is called Embodying the Story Through Character Interpretation.
Hmm.
And my website is American Lives with an S,
Hmm.
americanlives.net. So you can go to the products thing and I'll fix that link.
Okay, perfect. And
Yeah.
when you have it up, I'll put it up on our show notes,
Yeah.
so
Good.
people can can
Yeah.
find it easily.
Right. Right.
Well, have we missed anything? Do you feel like we've covered quite a bit, but
We
is
have
there
covered
anything
fun.
that we haven't touched on?
I just a shout out to moms.
Mm,
You know, this is the Mother's Day show, and most of my characters were mothers, and um, I don't have kids, not by choice. It just never happened.
mhm,
And I know that there's a whole level of richness in your lives who are mothers that I will never understand. Um, but it's always an honor to me to portray a mother, to be able to imagine. I have a really active imagination, and I imagine my children, and I'm proud of my children, and I
mhm,
grieve for my children,
mhm,
and just that little taste of the emotion that I know you have on a level I'll never understand.
mhm,
Um, there's like I said, my mom is my best friend in the world, and
mhm,
moms do so much more than just care for kids. Um, they they have such a huge impact on who those kids turned out to be and how those kids feel about themselves. And um, moms are amazing.
mhm. Mothers
Yay,
make the
mom.
world go round.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this show today. This was
It
such a
was so much
pleasure.
fun. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this revolutionary mother's journey. Tell us about your mother or a mother that inspired you. We want to hear about the impact a historical mother or your mother has had on your life. And you can do that if you're watching on YouTube. You can comment down below. Or we also have a Facebook group that you can join where we continue the conversation. So we love hearing from our audience. So we really encourage our audience members to continue chatting with us about what their thoughts were about the show. You can find Darci's website and her book on our website, which is fabricoffolklore.com, and we'll have those links in our show notes. So you can easily buy her book if you are a teacher or someone who works for an educational uh, venue that you feel like this might be a useful book for you. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to the show. And if you have, give yourself a high five. Thank you so much. And for those of you, don't forget, subscribe. And while you were there, give us a 5-star review. And if you, it's so helpful, like I said before. We are on social medias, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Those are where you can follow us and like us. Thanks so much for listening to Fabric of Folklore. Once again, I'm Vanessa Y. Rogers, and until next time, keep the folk alive.